coming up.
Minister, with all due respect, your government sets the policies and directives that allow for violent offenders to be downgraded from maximum security prisons. The Canadian correction system is your responsibility, and you must take responsibility for this failure and answer to Canadians. Do you have anything to add to that?
So specifically, Deputy Chief Johnson of Toronto noted that almost 50% of all offenders that they apprehend for auto thefts are repeat offenders. Minister, will you acknowledge that your government's bail policies are directly contributing to the auto theft crisis in this country and implement stiffer penalties on repeat violent offenders?
Saying when it comes to the regulations, the buck stops with the government, correct?
This decision has had an immediate effect on basically freezing and, in the words of some RCMP officers, terminating child predator investigations in Canada. And some believe that Canada has now become the safest place in the world to be a child predator. I wonder if you can give your comments on that, Minister.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
You can't imagine how excited I am to take your questions.
Thank you, Minister, and we're going to move right into questioning. Mr. Shipley, you're up first, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Minister, and hopefully that excitement continues for the next hour. Thank you, Chair, and to all the witnesses and Minister for being here this morning. Minister, I'll start off with you, please. Canadians and victims of crimes are outraged that you and your government, without consultation with victims' families, has allowed the likes of Paul Bernardo, Luca Magnotta, Michael Rafferty, and Russell Williams, some of our worst offenders in Canadian history, to live out their days comfortably in medium security prison. Why are you and your government putting the rights of violent, heinous offenders ahead of the rights of victims?
Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Shipley, thank you for the question. Obviously, the concerns of victims and the rights of victims are at the center of every action our government would take in this most difficult space. My colleagues will know very well that the decision around the transfers of individual inmates, there are 13,500 approximately people serving time in federal penitentiaries. The transfer of these inmates is made by independent professional public servants on a series of criteria, the most important of which, of course, is community safety. The Correctional Service always works with identified victims in these circumstances, and I have faith that they will make the right decisions, including to keep, obviously, communities safe when these transfers happen.
Minister, with all due respect, your government sets the policies and directives that allow for violent offenders to be downgraded from maximum security prisons. The Canadian correction system is your responsibility, and you must take responsibility for this failure and answer to Canadians. Do you have anything to add to that?
The transfer of inmates from, as I said, maximum, for example, to medium security institutions is something that's gone on for a long time. I think it's instructive to note, Mr. Chair, that the highest number of these transfers from maximum to medium security occurred in 2012, 2013, when 291 inmates were transferred. And in 2013, 2014, 319 of these offenders were transferred. So this is not new, Mr. Chair, that the Correctional Service, in their professional judgment, applying criteria, the most important of which, of course, is community safety, makes these decisions. And I think it's a bit disingenuous to pretend that this is something new, or to pretend that an elected minister should be the one deciding where individual inmates serve their sentences in the federal system.
Thank you, Minister. I believe the past is the past, and we're here to make new legislations and move forward. People are concerned nowadays, and I don't understand the laughter. This is a very serious issue. Minister, members on your side are laughing over this issue. Canadians are upset. Minister, we know that the costly carbon tax is negatively impacting the budgets of police services, particularly due to the increased cost of heating and fueling policing facilities, detachments, and vehicle fleets. Millions of taxpayer dollars a year are being spent on the carbon tax instead of stopping crime. Will you send a clear message of support to our hardworking police officers across the country and spike the hike on April 1st?
It may come as a surprise to you, Mr. Chair, but I support our government's carbon pricing regime. I think it invests, puts more money into the pockets of 8 out of 10 Canadians, as we know well. My colleague uses the line, spike the hike. We'll hear it probably later today in question period. I would expect a number of times, so it's good to start the day with that phrase very early in the morning. But I think Canadians expect, including people who work for police services, you somehow made the bridge from budgets of police officers to climate change to carbon pricing. I would assume that the men and women who serve in national security and police organizations across the country are also concerned about climate change. In many cases, these people are on the front lines of some of the most dangerous events caused by climate change. So I have every confidence they understand that the government is pursuing an appropriate course of action.
Thank you, Minister. I'll give my last bit of time to MP Motts.
Thank you, Minister. The OPP Commissioner, the Deputy Chief of Peel Regional Police, the Deputy Chief of Toronto Police, and the Chief of Laval have come out have come to this committee and told us that the lack of meaningful penalties for auto thefts and the revolving door of the quick release on bails have made the auto theft crisis even worse. So specifically, Deputy Chief Johnson of Toronto noted that almost 50% of all offenders that they apprehend for auto thefts are repeat offenders. Minister, will you acknowledge that your government's bail policies are directly contributing to the auto theft crisis in this country and implement stiffer penalties on repeat violent offenders?
Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Motts, thank you for that question. It's an important question. We certainly share, I think, the concern of all people at this committee and Canadians around the alarming increase in auto theft and the increasingly violent circumstances surrounding this crime. I have spoken to many of the senior police officials that my colleague outlined. My colleague, the Minister of Justice, who would be responsible for changes, for example, to the criminal code or to bail legislation, is in a better position than I am to speak to specific legislative measures. But I think the Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice have all acknowledged that the public is understandably concerned about some of these repeat offenders who are in the context of a violent crime, an increasingly violent crime. We acknowledge that would be released after multiple convictions in this space. So we're obviously interested in looking at all appropriate measures and working with the women and men that you identified who are on the front line of this important work. And I'll continue to be very involved in this issue to look for further investments. And perhaps, Mr. Chair, I know when I have to leave later this morning, my colleagues from the RCMP and the CBSA, I think, have some good news to share with the committee in terms of our increased efforts, recognizing that we can continue to do more and must continue to do more in all moments in this important issue.
Thank you, Chair, and I will address all of my questions directly to the witnesses through you. Thank you to all the witnesses. Thank you, Minister, for being here. Commissioner Kelly, can you please confirm that disgraced former Colonel Russell Williams is also at La Casa, which houses Paul Bernardo and Luca Magnotta?
No, I cannot confirm. I cannot confirm that information.
Now, how about Guy Turcotte? Is he also there?
I can also not confirm that information.
Did you confirm that Luca Magnotta was there? Did the CSC eventually confirm that?
Well, that's in the public domain right now.
And how about Paul Bernardo? Did the CSC eventually confirm that they were there?
That's also was in the public domain.
I'm not asking whether it was in the public domain. I'm asking whether the CSC confirmed it for those two offenders, but you're not prepared to confirm it for the other two. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, so we have one set of rules and another set of rules. I'm clear there. Now, Minister, the regulations, as you know, we have the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act talks about the regulations. We're clear, obviously, on that. Now, when it comes to the regulations, the government, the minister, you have control over those regulations, correct?
No, there's a process through Treasury Board and a regulatory process, but I recognize that it's in the hands of the Cabinet, yes.
It is in the hands. So the final say over the regulations is with the government. We can be clear on that, correct?
Again, I'm not an expert on parliamentary procedure. I think there's a committee, a joint scrutiny of regulations committee. Our colleagues in the Senate are very interested in these issues. I think
Minister, let's not get in.
But if you want to have an esoteric discussion on the regulatory process, I'd be happy to have officials.
I'm not having an esoteric discussion. I'm saying when it comes to the regulations, the buck stops with the government, correct?
Again, there's a parliamentary review process that I'm not familiar with, so I get the trap in the question. I'll say yes, and then you'll find an example. So I recognize that regulations are in the hands of the Cabinet.
It's no trap. It's actually very clear. The reality is that the government creates the regulations. Then the CSC, Correctional Service of Canada, implements those regulations. Okay? Those regulations allowed for the transfer of Bernardo and Magnotta. Okay? So you have the ability to change those regulations, correct?
The government has a general authority as long as it's within the four corners of the statute to change regulations.
I'm not talking about the authority. In this case, Minister, the government could change the regulations and it hasn't, correct?
Our government has confidence that the regulations are appropriate in giving the correctional service, in their independent and professional judgment, the responsibility of assigning convicted federal offenders, in this case, people convicted of murder, to the appropriate, secure federal penitentiary.
So in this case, you are okay with the likes of Magnotta, Bernardo, and Williams being not only in medium security, but being together at La Casa, correct?
Well, again, for operational security reasons that the commissioner can elaborate, we don't discuss or actually do videos telling Canadians where particular inmates are serving their sentences. It's for the security of the men and women who work in those institutions. So that's an irresponsible course that I don't think we're going to start on. And I share the concern that Canadians have about...
Minister, we're not talking about my conduct. We're talking here about the government and whether you will create regulations. Because those regulations allowed the transfer of Bernardo, they allowed the transfer of Williams, and they allowed the transfer of Magnotta. And you're here telling us, no, CSC is going to do their job. Minister, you have the opportunity to change those regulations right here, right now. Will you commit to do this? Because you've said we don't intervene on specific cases. I'm not asking for you to intervene on a specific case, Minister. I'm asking for you to intervene on a class of offenders. Will you intervene on a class of offenders, an injustice that has happened, and change those regulations right here, right now?
Well, again, if you want to be technical, I actually can't change those regulations right here and right now. I explained to you there's a Treasury Board process
will you
with the
commit
governor
right now
with
to
the governor and council. So no, I can't change those regulations right here and right now, Mr. Chair.
Will you commit to changing those regulations to address this class of offender, yes or no?
I will commit to ensure that those regulations which focus as their most important objective on public safety are appropriate to give the correctional service the authority to keep federally sentenced inmates in secure federal prisons to protect the public. That's a very important
objective. So it's appropriate that Paul Bernardo is in medium security, and you are fine with that. Minister, I will take it that you don't care that Paul Bernardo is in medium security. I will take it as that way because you're not prepared to act. Because if you're not prepared to act, then what are we even talking about this for? It's someone else's problem, but no, Minister, this lays directly at your feet. When was the last time you went to La Casa, Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Caputo. Your time's up, please. Mr. Biddle, you're up, please, for 5.
Minister, there was a pretty groundbreaking decision earlier this month of the Supreme Court, the Biavitz decision. I wonder if you can tell us about what the impact of that decision has been in the last month.
So again, I'm not familiar with the precise details of the decision. Happy to answer Mr. Loy's question, but the Associate Deputy Minister would be the best one to give you the precise answer to your question.
Thank you. And, going into the decision, the Biavitz decision is in regards to Internet Protocol addresses, IP addresses. And these IP addresses are essential tools, essential evidence for our law enforcement to track down and prosecute child predators. Under the Supreme Court decision, it has now been ruled that there's a judicial authorization required in order to get those IP addresses. It's the equivalent of saying you need a search warrant to look in the phone book. This decision has had an immediate effect on basically freezing and, in the words of some RCMP officers, terminating child predator investigations in Canada. And some believe that Canada has now become the safest place in the world to be a child predator. I wonder if you can give your comments on that, Minister.
Well, that obviously would not be a circumstance that's at all acceptable. I am informed that the RCMP and CSIS are obviously looking at the court decision and determining, based on some legal advice, the operational impacts of that decision. getting access to an IP address, I wouldn't have compared to looking in a phone book. I think that's a little bit disingenuous. These are areas that are governed by law and a body of case law, but we recognize that the police, the RCMP and other police partners, and CSIS, in the case of national security investigations, need appropriate access to that information, and will take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that the police have access to that information, while obviously respecting the Charter of Rights and cases that
thank you,
the courts
Minister,
will
for
decide.
that. And I'm not that reassured because we do have RCMP officers who are speaking out already on this. They spoke out earlier this month, and they said Canada must act quickly. This ruling opens a huge gap in our ability to protect kids and stop offenders from preying on them. There must always be a balance between citizen privacy and the state. But in the words of this RCMP officer, who is on Twitter, Sergeant Carrie Shima, this decision has put our children in the crosshairs. Those are the words of RCMP officers on the front lines. It's now been 3 weeks. Your government has now unveiled massive new legislation, the Online Harms Act, and yet I can find nothing in your Online Harms Act that deals with the fallout from this very concerning decision, which, in the words of an RCMP officer, has essentially terminated investigations into online sex offenders and identifying child victims. We cannot allow our country to be a safe haven for child predators. What are we going to do about this immediately, Minister?
So, Mr. Chair, I share, obviously, Mr. Lloyd's view that we can't allow Canada to become a safe haven for child predators. That's a circumstance that would be obviously completely inappropriate. I have confidence that the RCMP, respecting the law, respecting decisions of the Supreme Court and the Charter, will come to the government with advice, as will CSIS, on the most appropriate way to ensure that they have the tools to do that exact work that Mr. Lloyd correctly identified. And perhaps the Commissioner or others can discuss this in the second part. But, Mr. Chair, I think the important principle is that in a case where an important Supreme Court decision reviews authorities
Sorry,
like
Minister,
that.
I do only have about a minute left. I just want to say, how far are you willing to go to protect the children in this country? Would you be willing to consider using the notwithstanding clause if that were the only option to allow prosecutors or allow RCMP to do these investigations?
We're obviously not going to answer hypothetical questions like that. Our views in terms of the notwithstanding clause are well known. I think Mr. Lloyd is well ahead of himself in concluding that the advice that I'm going to get as Minister with my colleague, the Minister...
I'm not making any conclusions, Minister.
Mr. Lloyd, you
I'm just
asked me a
asking
question.
how far you're willing to go to protect children in this country. Is that
do
how far you're
everything
willing
that
to
we
go?
lawfully can to protect children and support the women and men in the RCMP and CSIS and other agencies that do this important work. They are doing effective and good work in this area.
They can't
and the
because of
government's
this
job
decision.
is to ensure
They
they
can
have
no
the
longer do that work
resources and the
because of this
authorities to
decision.
do that work.
Thank you.